The title of this lecture is Preaching and Race, and I'll be drawing on a lot of material in my PhD dissertation from Vanderbilt University entitled Preaching About Race, a Homiletic for Racial Reconciliation. According to Michael Omi and Howard Winant, race is a concept that signifies and symbolizes social conflicts and interests by referring to different types of human bodies, especially differences in skin tone, facial features, and hair texture. Racism is any program or practice of injustice legitimated by race. In the United States, racism is primarily the expression of systemic power over people of color. Indeed, Ronald Potter argues that the systemic violence against Native Americans and African Americans is our nation's original sin. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s pointed the United States toward racial justice, but the profound problem of racism remains. According to Brad Braxton, the slavery and segregation of the 17th through 20th centuries have been replaced by the subtle, sophisticated racism of the 21st century. Leanne Bell, Barbara Love, and Rosemarie Roberts chronicle racial disparities in opportunities and outcomes in the areas of education, labor, housing, and criminal justice. For example, school districts with mostly white students have more money to spend per student than school districts with mostly students of color. A 2004 study showed that job applicants with common black names were much less likely to be called in for an interview than job applicants with common white names, even though all the applicants submitted exactly the same resume. White people pay less interest than people of color with similar mortgages. The poverty rate among whites is much lower than that among African Americans, Hispanics, and Native Americans. White persons receive lighter punishments than people of color with similar criminal records. Racial minorities receive a lower quality of health care than white persons. According to Human Rights Watch, black men are nearly 12 times as likely to be imprisoned for drug convictions as adult white men. In rape cases, white complainants are more likely to be viewed as rape victims when the attackers are black. On the other side of the coin, a non-white male accused of rape is far more likely than his white male counterpart to be seen by jurors and judges as a rapist. So says Jacqueline Batalora. In murder cases wherein a black person is accused of killing a white person, the probability of the defendant being sentenced to death is far greater than when the homicide victims and perpetrators fall into any other racial pattern, according to Peggy C. Davis. The social power of racism is so keen that implicit attitude tests, such as those offered by Harvard University and the University of Chicago, show that many who think themselves to be egalitarian unconsciously associate good with white and bad with black. The subtle racism of 21st century America is a civilizational racism, a mindset that assumes whiteness to be normative and superior. This tacit yet pernicious form of racism is born of a socio-cultural atmosphere long saturated with the ideology of white superiority. Civilizational racism occurs on the level of our broadest and most basic and normative assumptions, making white superiority common sense. While the Trail of Tears and Jim Crow are behind us, the momentum of history has carried civilizational racism into the present. Due to the lasting impact of our history, today the American subconscious is socialized to presume that white flesh is more valuable than dark flesh. In order to examine race in relation to American culture and Christian preaching, I'm going to employ a discipline called critical race theory. Critical race theory is a discipline formulated by legal scholars, mostly scholars of color, whose work challenges how race is constructed and represented in the legal arena in the United States, and more broadly in American culture at large. Since race is a formal legal concept in the United States, and legal meanings of race have exerted lasting influence in American race relations, critical race theory is an indispensable resource for analyzing race and racism in America. Critical race theory emerged in the 1970s as a result of dissatisfaction with traditional civil rights discourse and the stalled progress of the civil rights movement. Legal scholars such as Derek Bell, Richard Delgado, and Alan Freeman began to ponder ways to address new, subtler varieties of post-civil rights movement racism. These scholars theorize race as a social construction that influences life in America in a multitude of ways. My goal in this lecture is to show how critical race theory's keen analyses of racial dynamics can assist preachers in addressing racism, which is such an enormous and long-standing problem that it is a homiletic imperative for preachers to address. In what follows, I will offer an overview of critical race theory in which I underscore themes that are germane for preachers who wish to understand and repudiate racism in America in faithfulness to Jesus Christ. Here are 7 key principles of critical race theory for preachers to understand. The first is a social constructionist view of race. Critical race theory views race as a product of social thought and interaction. Race is not an objective category that corresponds to biological reality, as has often been assumed, but instead a category that society produces, alters, and retires at will. Recent science verifies that race is a social construction. Research has shown that there are no genetic qualities shared by all blacks, but not by non-blacks. Correspondingly, there are no genetic qualities shared by all whites, but not by non-whites. In fact, genetic research has found that there's more genetic variation within the white population and within the black population than between these populations. To acknowledge that race is not defined by innate human differences is not to deny its impact. Race plays a prominent role in socio-political structures. For example, race suffuses all types of law, including property law, contracts law, criminal law, federal courts, family law, and corporate law. Race also plays a leading role in our personal lives, affecting our habits of speech and dress, even our style of walking. Race is a contributing factor in our job possibilities, economic prospects, political tendencies, and place of residence. While race is not an objective fact, it is nonetheless obvious. We are socialized in a way that makes race common sense, a fundamental category through which we understand the world. Scientific studies of children evince the powerful effects of racial socialization. For example, when a black child was asked about making a little girl from clay, she said that white clay should be used instead of brown clay because white clay would make a better girl. Although race is socially fabricated, its social and psychological influence should not be underestimated. In light of the social provenance of race, preachers can decry biological theories of race while taking seriously the acute impact race exerts as a social reality. Understanding the social origins of racism can possibly provide encouragement, for if racism is produced by society, it can also be reduced by society. Yet the power of racism is so pervasive and coercive that devitalizing it may require a transcendent appeal. Many people may take a theological approach to racial reconciliation more seriously than a humanistic or political plea for racial reconciliation. W.E.B. Du Bois was on to this years ago. His writings were laced with theological and biblical references. If it is the case that theological arguments for racial justice may be the best rhetorical possibility we have, then preachers may have a special role to play in the ongoing project of racial reconciliation in the United States. The second principle of critical race theory I want to highlight is the ordinariness of racism. Critical race theory maintains that racism is ordinary in the United States. Racism is not a special event, it's the routine experience of persons of color. Alan Freeman contends that racial discrimination can be approached from either the perspective of the perpetrator or the perspective of the victim. The perpetrator perspective identifies racism as racist acts, but the victim perspective identifies racism as normal social conditions facing racial minorities. The victim perspective is apt because small acts of racism called microaggressions permeate American social existence. Mundane racist interactions, whether intentional or unintentional, incessantly reinforce white privilege and disparage people of color. For example, when black people attend social gatherings that historically have been all-white events, whites often cannot censor their eyes from giving black guests the look, an optic expression that inquires, "What are you doing here?" Alarmingly, critical race theorists describe such microaggressions as automatic. Critical race theorists observe that the perpetrator perspective enables recognition of only the most overt or egregious forms of racism, that some people in other literature call the perpetrator perspective the KKK view of racism. It only allows recognition of the most overt and horrible forms of racism. This is a critical shortcoming because much racism is subtle and routine. Subtle racism can be just as damaging as overt racism, and therefore subtle racism is the primary target of critical race theory's analytic and activist efforts. Underlying the victim perspective is the assumption that racial minorities have experiential expertise on the topic of racism. The idea that racial minorities have special competence on racial matters has been labeled the voice of color thesis. For example, Marie Matsuda advocates looking to the bottom or locating those who have experienced racial discrimination on society's underside because they are an important epistemological source when analyzing the concrete effects of racism. Epistemologically speaking, critical race theory favors the real-life experiences of persons of color over the abstractions of scholars. The notion that racial issues should be viewed from the perspective of racial minorities rather than from the perspective of whites is perhaps the clearest unifying thing within critical race theory. It's important for preachers to understand that the primary form of racism in the United States is social patterns that privilege white people and oppress persons of color. Racially responsible churches that are predominantly white, therefore, can attempt a shift from the perpetrator perspective, which views racism as racist acts, to the victim perspective, which views racism as the routine conditions of society facing racial minorities. Only when people are convinced that racism exists, that racism is ordinary, and that racism has grave effects on people of color, can further work toward racial reconciliation even be endeavored. The third principle of critical race theory I want to present in this lecture is the concept of unconscious racism. Critical race theory suggests that much racism is unconscious. According to Charles Lawrence III, everyone is infected with the disease of racism, but most of us are unaware of it. Lawrence explains that our historical experience has made racism an essential aspect of our culture. Yet paradoxically, modern society denounces racism as immoral in general. When our ingrained racist ideas encounter the societal ethic that condemns them, our minds respond by excluding racism from consciousness. Lawrence contends that much racism is tacitly transmitted and unconsciously learned, especially racial stereotypes. He also insists that unconscious racism has the same deleterious effects as intentional racism. Lawrence challenges the legal doctrine of discriminatory purpose, which requires that discriminatory intent be proved, because Lawrence believes the injury of racial inequality exists irrespective of the decision makers' motives. In short, and this is a key point, whether racism is intentional or unconscious does not matter as much as its harmful effects. Many Americans conceive racism as a matter of individual actions. This individualistic approach usually stems from the assumption that society is non-racist, an assumption that is based upon society's stated racial ethic. Yet Thomas Ross insists, and I will quote Ross at length, "The public ideology has become non-racist while the culture continues to teach racism. The manifestations of racial stereotypes pervade our media and language. Racism is reflected in the complex set of individual and collective choices that make our schools, our neighborhoods, our workplaces, and our lives racially segregated. Racism today, paradoxically, is both irrational and normal, at once inconsistent with the dominant public ideology and embraced by each of us, albeit for most of us at the unconscious level." Underestimating the prevalence of racism permits the rhetoric of white innocence, which saturates race-related discussions in America. When one begins to confront unconscious racism, the rhetoric of white innocence falls apart. Focusing first on our own re-education, white preachers in particular can begin to acknowledge and strive to recognize our own unconscious racism, and then begin to nurture a similar effort among others, including our parishioners. At the same time, we can recognize that the results of racism ultimately are more important than the motives, and that unconscious racists can perpetuate the most damaging forms of racial injustice. This is difficult since people frequently focus on interior motives when discussing racism. Especially white persons tend, in my experience and in much literature, to focus on the internal motives pertaining to race rather than the social results of race. Perhaps our obsession with intention is not so much an introspective moral examination as a strategy for disregarding racism's consequences. Racially responsible Christian preaching belies the rhetoric of white innocence and facilitates the transformation of white guilt into white repentance. The fourth principle of critical race theory I want to share is called the transparency phenomenon. One important form of unconscious racism is the transparency phenomenon. Barbara Flagg defines it as the tendency of whites not to think about whiteness, or about norms, behaviors, experiences, or perspectives that are white specific. Transparency meaning white people tend to look through whiteness rather than at whiteness. The proclivity of whites to disregard our own racial characteristics may be a defining characteristic of whiteness. As Flagg puts it, to be white is not to think about it. The transparency phenomenon makes white culture appear neutral, raceless, and normal. Transparency permits whites to disavow the ideology of white superiority while imposing white culture on people of color. White preachers, therefore, can take steps to recognize our own whiteness. This is essential because, as Ian Haney Lopez puts it, whiteness exists as the linchpin for the systems of racial meaning in the United States, and other races are tropes for inferiority that orbit the unacknowledged norm of whiteness. Effective anti-racist work makes non-obvious white norms explicit. For example, according to sociologist Pamela Perry, the values of individualism, personal responsibility, mind over body, self-control, self-determination, and the belief that the present holds no debt to the past are characteristic of white culture, although many assume that these characteristics are just normative, universally valid. Preachers that find ways to identify such norms as white can begin to rob whiteness of its incredible ability to be both nothing and everything at the same time, and thereby we can participate in innervating its social sway. The goal is to expose whiteness as a form of particularity, posing as universality. I'll return for the second half of this lecture on preaching and race.